I'm going to be philosophizing on cannabis and its importance to developing a philosophy based off first and preliminary principles, but not just preliminary principles, ones that arrive directly through our perceptions and our preceptors that can be altered through ingesting physical substances that have a direct impact on our psychological minds, and in particularly consciousness, altering the states of our direct qualia of perception, and also how we perceive information in relation to how we would, say, in the same circumstances, genuinely tend to perceive information in the same or highly similar way, whereas when we consume a substance like marijuana that pretty robustly, as in noticeably, if you take enough of a dose to be able to do that sort of thing, which is not, say, like a microdose where it's so little where you would have a subtle effect, but maybe a couple puffs of even a joint would be able to produce a robust enough shift in perceptions that would be able to demonstrate these shifts in qualia that we would otherwise typically, in which is often prior to any exposure of psychedelics, thought of as something that's unchangeable by any physical object or ingestible substance. Though I know through my own independent experiences of consuming various psychedelic substances, including marijuana and psilocybin mushrooms, that I have had in both occasions mixed with various delicacies, but more so have been experimenting with psilocybin in terms of various desserts. But when it comes to marijuana, I often stick to more butters, and I'll sometimes put that on cookies, and that can be pretty delectable, and it'll have different effects if you ingest it that way compared to if you smoke it. But regardless, there are these effects that pertain to physical laws and also psychodynamical laws. So we have thermodynamics interplaying with psychodynamics or psychological dynamics. I want to move away from any sort of Freudian theory, but I want to strictly talk about the direct relationship to thermodynamics because it pertains directly to it, and these high entropy states, and also our need to stabilize and form consistent patterns of perception and behavior to make any sense of the world and the surroundings in a coherent manner, and that one that's congruent with our expectations, but also can form these patterns of coherence or sense making in relation to patterns of congruence, which is applying information to cases or actualities of existence in which this is not just true, but it's actually the case and can pertain to a matter of fact. But also alongside that, what's probably more important is whether or not it's realistic and applies to these subject-object events in relation to individual conditions and situated relations that are operating dynamical to various reciprocal related depictors and markers of what exists in terms of physical structures and what can be perceived through our direct senses and perceptions as another individual in the surrounds that can behave, but also the lack of other individuals and just the independence of our own mind in a physical surrounds that has a direct impact on it just by being there, but can have a greater impact by engaging more meaningfully in it, or even just taking interest in some aspect of it and really immersing yourself in that emotion and seeing what that entails in terms of how that physically directs you in the world and in particular, where you discover your self-direction as that, because that is what your self-direction is, when you're propelled by your own psychological minds through often your own emotions or feelings that are direct to the qualities of your experience, what you feel directly or what you think directly, and the quality of knowledge. What's the flavorings of the knowledge that you are consuming? What is it like to experience a state of learning? Is it just nothing? Are you totally indifferent to everything? We know that indifference is definitely important for high-level intellectual thinking and being able to theorize, but here we're talking about an intellectual task or a philosophical skill that we develop and we hone, and it's very much a self-virtue and something that we definitely should strengthen. But it's also important to note that there's a great deal of positive emotions and engaging emotions that are necessary for learning. And emotions can't necessarily just be separated out of the learning process. So engaging our emotions and knowing where they fit is part and parcel of an individual who's exemplifying a high level of self-intelligence. So it's important not just to, say, regulate our emotions, but to experience them wisely in terms of understanding their use or resourcefulness, in terms of supplying us with fuel sources and energy supplies and sources of knowledge that inform our ways of knowing, and also our ways of deepening knowledge, and also expanding our repertoires for behaving more efficaciously and agentically in the world with greater amounts of freedom and goodening conscience that is arrived at through understanding the consequences and the potential greater harm, as well as our direct capacity and known capacity to be able to innovate and effectively reduce that harm and increase the amount of good in terms of being able to acquire the necessities, what's essential, what's good, at less of an expenditure or cost or exchange rate, as well as to validate the existence of what's actually true and what's most important and essential, and to, for the sake of those purposes, ignore what is less essential and less important until an individual is prosperous enough or has a sense of what's good enough in terms of not requiring that as something that's necessary to be able to maintain or continue their existence or survival, as what's most pressing and important due to the circumstances or situations they might find themselves in. But to be able to understand the position an individual is in through their own subjectivity and sense of what their existence currently is like and what they would like it to be like, and even the next few minutes moving forward, but which can span any specified indeterminate set of times, one that is truly open and free to the mind that you wish to express and what you wish to express within that operating system through your seeming and deeming of its qualities and judgments and attributions that relate to how we experience emotions of all kinds and affects that are positive and negative, that involve things like enthusiasm or joy or interest, ecstasy, or even the feeling of awesomeness, which is very energizing, highly energizing and interesting and enthusing, and it engages our body and it releases adrenaline and cortisol and regulates the stress response and strengthens the immune system. And it also releases brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is associated with learning and higher complex processing of emotion is, in particular, these awesome emotional experiences, very deeply bound to optimal and optimized learning, and probably the most important emotion for that. It restructures the nervous system through high entropy and high level metabolisms that integrate particularly novelty and distinctive information and allow us to innovate on our interests, and also granulize information. That means refine it from what we previously know into higher states of masterfulness, and being able to grasp the substance of the content near immediately upon recognition of it or need for it, necessitating the knowledge in any particular circumstance or situation. And it very much, knowledge becomes a part of us when we're experiencing the emotion of awesome. We know it to be awesome when we experience it, and still there's this perplexity and complexification that is deeply future oriented. It beckons forth the will to explore the wayward sun that dawns forward a new day to do something worthy of what you would have wanted to do and do want to do at nearly any given moment, but not necessarily forever. Rather to appreciate it as something that is truly a one-in-a-lifetime experience that is possible at each potential moment, and which during that moment, you know, as a matter of fact, through your subjective truths of existence, that this one experience itself makes life worth living and meaningful, and can even stimulate a deeper sense of purposefulness moving forward on our meaning and purposes, and deepenings of knowledge that are necessary for self-direction in relation to realizing a purpose of any sort, and recognizing it in terms of its defining characters of congruence, cogency, and coherence that require us to understand various relationships of causation and different defining functional structures regarding the physicality and the psychology of the mind that pertain to perception, behavior, and the physical structures of the environment, alongside the information processes that are flowing through distinctive systems involving particularly psychological minds, but also the natural physical environment in which we can characterize it in terms of having cognitive, operational information processes that are non-conscious and non-perceptual and do not pertain to psychological minds, but must be processed by psychological minds to be made sense of or to exist at all, and which also themselves have approximate categories of symbolic representation associated with our sense perceptors and our sense perceptions, as well as our precepts of the self, that interpret the sense as well as perceptual information and the information from our minds and ourselves that are sourced from our consciousness, and particularly our psyche, that is operating in these parallelisms and deeper, complex cognitive processes that involve both conscious and unconscious dynamics that operate through what has taken millennia through the incremental changes in fluid dynamic relationships between cellular automaton that have evolved into tissues and organs of whole, complex, and complexifying and increasingly more complexifying, and in doing so alongside higher states of entropy and dynamically shifting landscapes and environmental conditions that themselves are shaped along the movements and operations and perceptions, consciousness of organisms, but in which all organisms are in some sense caused from. And this is because the physical universe evolved prior, but at higher levels of emergence there increased a massive amount of causal forces that are a result of consciousness, which imbues unique laws that are and must be what introduces information to the physical universe, as well as the sense making that's necessary for information to exist at all. And information itself is probably the most influential force. It's not just that information is, say, abstract, is that it's actually fluid, dynamical, physical thing that is bound and exists and is only validated and exists through the existence of the psychological mind, that beyond just being cognitive, as in terms of capable of processing information, that isn't, say, compartmentalized or temporarily abstracted out and stored in a different remote location for the purposes of extending the functionalities of the mind in a more practical and effective way with various degrees of efficacy and reliability that is significant enough to warrant a reason to concern yourself with its validity in terms of having a psychological effect that might be worth exploring more in its depth. But you can take an interest in potentially any sort of psychological study or finding insofar as it makes sense to you, and you can comprehend its substances in relation to the physical substance and the matters that it's referring directly to. And you can characterize it with whatever subject matter of your own conscience you would like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. And often what matters most in terms of being able to assess a strong and a valid study is that it tends to reemerge across different conditions and situations and replications and studies and controls that are used to be able to identify specific variables in which we're determining patterns of causation and effects and influences within specific scientific paradigms that have a basis in natural philosophy, in which we have developed a deep wealth of knowledge as well as highly detailed descriptions with apparent and direct resources and sourcings of information to evidence, physical evidence, in terms of what we can perceive in terms of photographs and of cave paintings and markings and descriptions that date back to various points in our early evolutionary history as Homo sapiens, and also which connect us to various common ancestors along our history, such as birds that began climbing trees, and other animals such as the gibbon or the bonobo that are our close relative alongside the chimpanzee, and which we primarily get our sense of innovativeness from through our grasping of hands and extension of our gaze function and coordination of our hand motor movements that are highly important for not just tool use but future orientation that's positive and allows us to expand more of our creative functions that have more in relation to do with sculpting a pathway forward for ourselves that molds into the environment physical information that is also imprinted in the body, and which extends our knowledge near immediately at a highly efficient rate, with the capacity to also model and think without directly having to build that right away with the hands at the ready, but to be able to cognize and to perceive the shape in which one would like an object to be, or to mold it a certain way, or to use a tool in a certain way that allows us to form more of these creative and innovative patterns of thought through how we extend our bodies and our visual systems and our minds in these hand motor coordinations that tend to be future oriented and are always pertaining to either right now in this moment as of present, or future instances, or thinking about the future rather than past situations. When we innovate, it's more of a future direction, or something in which there is an intent for us to move the use or utility of a function based on its purposes, and our purposing of the physical thing or object or thingy, whatever we're using, with an associated functionality that's incorporeal in nature, and incorporeal in a sense that's pertaining to our use of it through our connections from the cellular automaton that's processing that psychological information at different levels of constituency, not just through the nervous system but through the metabolizing of glucose even across our mitochondria that needs to synthesize adenosine triphosphate, which is what is the power fuelage source of our mitochondria and necessary for our body to do anything, and is direct to these energy expenditures and exchange rates that pertain directly to epigenetic transformations, and also are important for communicating with various aspects of the body, such as the adjacent neurons that are doing most of the psychological and higher order cognitive work, because they're specialized cells that pertain to the psychological mind, and not just the psychological mind, the psychological dynamical body and behavior that's all integrated into one corpus that is the self, and the embodying self, the embodied self, that is more true in some sense than the soul, because we can directly perceive it and know it through many individuals, rather than having to infer it or come to that based off our own subjective truths, whereas the body or even the mind is more direct in observable, we can infer it more easily, and it's more readily available. And so is self-expression, and therefore the self is more direct than some other concepts, including even consciousness itself, where consciousness itself seems to pose this great many scientific mysteries and even puzzles for natural philosophers and thinkers, and even for synthetic materialism, that I am the foremost philosopher and thinker who has contributed and posited the preliminary groundworks and laws that establish it. And I'll be discussing this further in a future video coming up soon.